As we continue this conversation about the health of the church, it makes sense that we need to have a conversation about the health of the leaders inside the church. I think you know this, that when it comes to the community, whether that be a home, a family, or whether that be a church or even kind of the greater household of a community or even a government, that it all rises and falls on leadership. And so in chapter 3, Paul starts this conversation by talking about what it looks like to have healthy leaders in the life of the church. Now, part of this is in response to the fact that the false teachers were not healthy. They were not healthy in their doctrine, nor were they healthy in their living, their motivations, and the way they lived their lives. And so Paul here is going to respond by saying, hey, how do we respond to this threat? How do we live a life in community? How do we make sure that in the life of the church, we're carrying our responsibilities and we're discipling one another and loving each other and living in this community in a way that upholds truth and therefore becomes a healthy witness? That brings us to 1 Timothy chapter 3. Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 3 is going to talk first about the example of those who are mature in their faith. We're going to use two labels, two terms to understand their responsibility. We could even say two titles to understand what they do. The first title would be overseer, and the second title would be elder. I think these actually describe the same group of people who have a responsibility. We'll come back to that in just a minute. In our next episode, we're going to talk about the second part of chapter 3, where Paul talks about those who are given the responsibility of being a deacon. And that word deacon can be understood as a minister or a servant as well. And I actually think these roles complement one another. They work together, and in many ways, they help continue to move the church forward when it comes to its discipleship, its maturity, its health, and the ability to witness to the greater world. If I were to actually somewhat point to them on the image of this household, I would say that in many ways, those who are the overseers and elders are responsible for this healthy foundation and how that impacts the rest of the house and kind of living up here in the life of the community, being a healthy, mature example. And the deacons really kind of in the life of this community that are responsible for many of the ways that that is lived out or served out in the life of the community. So we'll see those two roles complement one another. As we look at 1 Timothy chapter 3, we discover that Paul says, hey, this is like a really important thing. And the way that we know that is because he starts chapter 3 with this phrase that is a trustworthy saying. He says, this is a saying that is trustworthy. And he only uses that phrase in the pastoral epistles. He uses it 5 different times. And all of them, we could argue, are in direct contrast to what the false teachers are saying and what they're doing. So here Paul says, hey, one of the ways we can actually, not only confront, but prevent what is unhealthy in the life of the church is by having healthy leaders. And so here's a trustworthy saying, take this to the bank. This is worth listening to. And then he says, if anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. I want to unpack just a few phrases in this particular first verse. First is the word office. The ESV translates this verse and then supplies the word office to try to get at what they mean when it says he desires a noble task. So what is that task? Well, it's an office of overseer. I actually have maybe some, hesitation to translate with that word, mainly because of the connotations that we have with the word office. When I say the word office, oftentimes the connotation that come into mind are a position of power, maybe even status, maybe even in a building. They have the high level, high corner office. Or maybe it's kind of like the role of a president. Like they have a title, but we may not know exactly what they do, or vice president. But instead, this word overseer, if you're Timothy and you're hearing this word, you actually know what this is. It's a household word. This word overseer is a responsibility delegated by the master of the house or the head of the house. When the master leaves or when the master's about other business, he delegates this to an overseer, and then they actually manage the household on behalf of the master. It's not their household. They're not actually the one in power, but they do have a delegated responsibility. So responsibility language is actually part of my preference when it comes to language that we use in household leadership. I would never say my office is the title of dad. No, I'd say my responsibility is being a father. And so that responsibility language, I think, is inherent with this term that is then a metaphor for leadership of an overseer in a household. Now, the other thing that I would maybe want to say about that is that it is an official capacity. It is an official role and responsibility. And so I see what the ESV is doing with this word office. I would, again, maybe not use the word at all. If anyone aspires to be an overseer, or use the word responsibility. If anyone aspires to the responsibilities of an overseer. And then the second part of that phrase I want to unpack is he desires a noble task. Now, I again see what they're doing, trying to elevate this role because of the trustworthy saying to say this is a really important role. But the original language, that phrase noble task, is actually the phrase that we find other places in the pastoral epistles, especially 1 Timothy. It's the phrase good work. And if you remember, that's actually one of the walls in our household, godliness and good works. It's a theme. And we kind of miss the theme because of the translation. But one of the things I want to recognize is like this role is just like one of the roles in the household of living out the healthy doctrine, the healthy teaching. And this is just one of those responsibilities. It's not a greater one, but it's a really important one. And so the importance, of course, comes in the responsibility, the weight of the responsibility, not in the title. So you get what I'm trying to say? That when it comes to the metaphor or ecclesiology of how we understand the church, if we start to shift from some of our maybe even American models or sometimes even Roman or ancient models of the church, those metaphors that we use, and come back to some biblical metaphors, it may actually shift not only how we think of leadership, but how we live as leaders in the life of the church. I don't have a title that gives me then a privilege. It's not an honorific title. Hey, look how much I've grown into this title. But it's boy, someone needs to do that. And God has given me that responsibility, that task, and I'll do it for the sake of the community, not for my own sake. So I want us to understand those nuances. Then let's go into verse 2. Therefore, an overseer must be, because it's such a good work, an overseer must be above reproach. And I want us to notice this phrase, must be. This word is actually a word that's used a few times, not only here, but also in the book of Titus. And it's often used to describe kind of a portrait of either an elder, an overseer, or a deacon. We're going to see it used multiple times. And yet the sentence that starts in verse 2 is kind of a run-on sentence. And so sometimes those who translated it resupply this word. You'll notice it again down in verse 4. Resupply this phrase, must be, in order to avoid Paul's run-on sentence in the English language. But why that's important is this, is I think when Paul is actually drawing this picture of what it looks like to be, and sorry for the pathetic picture, but what it looks like to be a healthy leader in the life of the church, that this portrait actually has a title. And that title is this idea of being above reproach. In other Titus, as well as other sections of 1 Timothy, we're going to see the word blameless, right? They must be blameless. And so in this particular context, what Paul's doing is he's saying, I want to paint a picture in contrast to the false teachers of what it looks like to be in someone who's above reproach. Now, maybe we don't use that phrase very often. So what does Paul mean by that? Well, Paul means by the outside world, those that we're trying to bear witness to, as well as those in the community, that they can look at this leader and they could say, hey, this person's the real deal. They're not a hypocrite. In fact, that's some of the language he uses to describe the false teachers, is they're not really who they say they are. So how do we know that this person is above reproach? If that's the title of the portrait, how do we know that this person is blameless? Well, it's not that they don't have sin, right? We know that because you couldn't put anyone in that portrait. There's only one. It's just a picture of Jesus. So what does it look like then to be above reproach? Well, it is in contrast to being a hypocrite, right? They are a person who is mature in their discipleship and looking more and more like Jesus. But you can't accuse them of being someone who is not really a disciple, even though they say that they are. So maybe a way we could rephrase that would be this. In the Old Testament, we learn the phrase, don't take the Lord's name in vain. One of my favorite Old Testament professors would actually say the best way to translate would be don't take on the Lord's name in vain. Don't take on the name of Yahweh, or don't take on Jesus' name. Don't say I am a Christian and take on the name, the title, if you're not going to live that out. So don't actually paint yourself as a portrait of what it looks like to be like Jesus when you don't actually look the part. So what then does it look like to be an authentic person who is mature in their faith, looking more and more like Jesus, not perfect? I think it's important to say that because otherwise none of us should actually ever take on this responsibility. Well, here's what Paul then paints as brushstrokes of that portrait. They must be the husband of one wife, literally a one-woman man. Now, we could get into some question marks. In fact, one of the other alternative ways to understand this is not a portrait, but actually a checklist. Does an individual have to check every one of these boxes? Well, the question with the one-woman man is, what is Paul getting at here? What picture is he trying to paint? And I think the picture is a picture of fidelity, of course. It's a picture that this person isn't going around having relationships with multiple women. He is a one-woman man. But if we don't see it as a portrait, we see it merely as a checklist, maybe we'd ask the question, well, what if they're not married? Or what if like they're a widower and somewhere down the road, according to even scripture, they get remarried? Those questions come up when we start to see it under a different paradigm, under a different metaphor than this portrait idea that I think Paul is really getting at with this must be above reproach language. Now, we might ask the question, can they? Maybe what we should ask the question is, should they? Like, should they? With whatever is in their past. Maybe they have a divorce in their past, or maybe they are a widower in their past. Maybe we should ask the question, should they? And the question can come back to then this answer. Are they above reproach? Do they look like an authentic disciple? Not are they perfect, but are they actively pursuing Jesus? They can have a formerly I was story, because Paul does. Formerly I was a blasphemer. But are they today, as a mature follower of Jesus, are they mature to the point where other people, those who are in the community, those who are in the world, would say, there's a person who is actively and consistently trying to live like Jesus, and I want to live like them. And if I try to look like them and live like them, I will end up living like Jesus. I'll uphold the truth, and I'll have a healthy witness. So we want to recognize how these component parts, these brush strokes, then work under this phrase, must be above reproach. There's one example. A couple of more examples that Paul gives. Must be sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, and able to teach. Must not be a drunkard, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, and not a lover of money. Now, here's what I have found interesting in kind of my application of this and watching us apply this in the life of the church is sometimes when we have the checklist approach rather than the portrait approach is we actually kind of make our own tiered structure of the checklist. And maybe someone doesn't check off the they've been married before, but then we don't ever ask the hospitality question. Like, yeah, but they're incredibly hospitable, or they're not, but they're married and they have these other things. In fact, I find it really interesting that the phrase, they must not be a lover of money, but one of the things that we sometimes, I'm going to say unconsciously look for is someone who's really good with money. But we don't necessarily ask the question like, but are they a lover of money? You see, we can actually redraft our portrait and say, what are we actually looking for? And the portrait can sometimes become more a reflection of our culture and even our idolatry, our lack of health, than it is really a portrait of Christ. And so I think it's important for us to ask the question, not just can they, but should they? Who is best fit to make disciples? Who is not only able to teach the doctrine, but also is living out the doctrine in their life that is a good work and is godliness and reflects who Jesus is in the life of all of their relationships, whether that be their marriage or their parenting or the way they deal with money or the way they would deal with outsiders in their words. Are they harsh when it comes to the way they deal with substances like alcohol? You see, the other problem with the checklist is if it's a checklist, Paul's maybe missing some things. And in fact, in Titus, we could flip over to Titus and we see that the checklist changes. Well, if it's a checklist, then we probably just need to keep adding to it. But if it's a portrait, all Paul's trying to do is kind of paint this quick picture to say, yeah, they look like this. They look like a mature follower of Jesus. And so these are how I understand these parts to flow together. By the way, the contrast would then be, in 2 Timothy, we see a portrait of the false teachers, and they are held captive to do the will of the devil, the enemy. And Paul paints with brushstrokes there to say they look like this. They love silver. They are lovers of self. And it's the opposite portrait of what we see here. Let's go on with a few more things. They are not a drunkard. They're not violent. They're not gentle. They're not quarrelsome. They're not a lover of money. Verse 4, he must manage his own household well. Now, recognize again, Paul's ecclesiology of a household is that little households make up this greater household. Well, how do you know if someone's competent to be able to lead in this greater family that is the household of God, that he can be an overseer and be responsible for this task of caring for this greater family? Well, you know it by looking at his own family. And again, if we view it as a checklist, we might go, well, there is that one kid who rebelled. Well, yeah, that's actually what we find in scripture, right? Is that sheep sometimes wander. So the question may not be, can they? Maybe it should be, should they? And maybe we still need to evaluate. Maybe there's some hypocrisy. Maybe there are some issues there that we need to ask some honest questions. Are they really above reproach? Are they really blameless? And yet, do they ultimately come to a position in the life of the community where other people look at them and go, no, they are actually leading people closer to Jesus consistently. This is who they are. It's authentic. It's real, even if this other thing is going on over here. We go to verse 5, and Paul says, why? Like if someone does not know how to manage this little household, this micro household, how can they manage the entire household and care for this church? So our family, can I say this? Our family is our first evidence of our ability to disciple effectively. For some of you, maybe even in full-time vocational ministry, this might be something you need to hear. Your ability to lead and serve your family is actually the first evidence that we can look to be able to discern if you're going to be able to effectively disciple and lead the greater household, which is the church. And so there's a responsibility there that the overseers are given that is a mere reflection of what these, in this particular case, in this context of verse 5, of what these fathers are given as a responsibility there. Now, how do we actually come at getting at this portrait, let's say if a person is not a father? Well, could you ask the question, actually extrapolate that out and go, well, maybe they don't have this micro household, but they probably do have like a community that is their household. I mean, it's not the, American idea of, a mom and a dad and 3 kids and a dog, but the ancient form of household was actually broader than that. And we actually might be able to say, well, they might not have biological kids, but they have these kids around them that they're discipling, these students or people around them they're discipling that are younger than them. And we can actually discern this portrait from that image and go, no, so that now we actually can see that they're competent and able to do that in the greater household. So I hope you see how these component questions and parts are coming together in contrast of kind of these 2 ways of dealing with this text to help us understand then how to live this out, but also look for healthy leaders in the church. One of my concerns is that oftentimes we're looking for kind of a portrait of the, competent business person or the charismatic personality. And we slap them into a leadership role, but they're not actually fulfilling this picture of what Paul's trying to paint here. And then we go, why is the community not healthy? Why are we not growing in our discipleship? Why are we not mature? Well, our portrait of what we say is mature is actually not what Christ-like maturity looks like at all. So let's go to verse 6. Verse 6 says, he must not be a recent convert. So in other words, he must be mature in his faith. And this is where we actually get not just the word overseer as a responsibility, as a metaphor of responsibility, but also the connotation of an elder. The image of an elder in the life of a community and in a household was simply someone who's older. I want you to know this, though, that in the church, spiritual maturity doesn't have an age limit, right? Like you can be spiritually mature and be young, but you can also be completely immature and be old. And so when it comes to maturity, notice we're talking about like how long have they been a believer? Now in Ephesus, like this isn't like the church today to where the church has been around for a while. And yet the church in Ephesus has been established for a bit. But this looks different, by the way, than what the portrait looks like in Titus. Paul doesn't actually have this phrase because Titus is going on planting new churches. So the believers there, like a lot of them are new. And as they establish new elders, like elders in that sense were more mature, older than some of the new believers, and most of them were in the life of that community as well. So there's some fluidity and adaptability, I think, as part of God's design, written even into 1 Timothy and Titus in some of these portraits that are painted. But there's some wisdom here. Like this person shouldn't be a new convert. They should be mature. Why? Well, because by having this responsibility, they'll be arrogant. They'll be puffed up. They'll be filled with conceit. They'll be big-headed, and they'll fall into condemnation. I'm guessing that's maybe some of what happened with these false teachers. Paul names a few. And we've dealt with some of the ways that Paul wants to then confront them. Moreover, Paul says, verse 7, he must be thought well of by outsiders. This elder overseer must have a positive reputation with those as outsiders, must be above reproach. Notice the phrase must be again. Must be thought well of by outsiders because we don't want them to fall into disgrace. We don't want them to look back on the church and say, well, that church is full of people who are hypocritical liars, especially the leaders who are being held up as the ideal people to look like. I think the church should always have immature people if we are actually the church. We should always have immature believers, and we should always have younger people we're trying to bring to become more mature. But if we don't have anyone who's mature, then we've probably failed at their primary task, which is discipleship. Can I say this? And I hope it, adequately steps on toes and yet doesn't offend to the point of discouragement. If we don't have individuals in the life of our community that are competent and mature enough to take on the roles and responsibilities, and I would even say willing to because of their love for the community, take on the roles and responsibilities of overseers, elders, and in our next session, deacons, then it may actually reveal a lack of discipleship, a failure to disciple. That what we've been doing has actually neglected that primary task of growing people in their maturity in Christ and helping them understand in the life of the family the responsibilities that need to be taken place, but that people would then sacrifice and willingly take on those burdens of responsibility. You see, sometimes we've actually dug ourselves a hole. And why aren't we healthy? Well, it's because we've not been doing the very tasks that we've been called to do. And so what do we do? Well, then we compromise and we put people in roles of leadership who then cause a lack of health. And then the cycle continues. So this responsibility that we have to make disciples who are mature disciples, who then go out and make other disciples, like that's Jesus's primary calling for us. And there may actually be a litmus test, kind of a dash light in the life of some of our churches, that say, we're not adequately actually raising leaders and maturing them. And healthy leadership has a direct impact on the health of the church. And so those who are elders, the older, more mature spiritually, those who are then tasked with oversight in the household, in the community that God has called us to, that Christ is the head of, that this task is an important task. And we want to recognize that when it comes to this task, that their task becomes fourfold. What are they responsible for? Well, they're responsible for the discipleship of the disciples of the church. Like a parent raising up their children, teaching them. They're responsible for the teaching, the doctrine, this foundation that we find in the church. But not only the doctrine and the teaching of it when it comes to the words, but also then the living of that doctrine in their example. Notice the overseers and elders are an example of maturity. And so the example of that doctrine, that healthy teaching, that truth, they're responsible for the defense of it, confronting those who are teaching what is false. And then they're also responsible for the discipline inside the life of the community of those who are not consistently living it out. Someone has to have that responsibility. And if I were to kind of summarize the roles and responsibilities of an elder, of an overseer in your church, this would be it. Discipleship, doctrine, defense, and discipline. Maybe I'd add one more from James and maybe from Acts 20, prayer, right? And maybe that comes under kind of these categories. But maybe this is a fair point of evaluation, and I'll close with this. So then, I don't know, go into your elders meeting if you're an elder and ask the question like, do we talk about these four things? Do they make the agenda? Is this the burden that I carry? Because my hunch is that sometimes those of us who would say, hey, our church is struggling with health, these might not make the list. We might have another list. It might be money. It might be numbers. It might be some other list and some other agenda. But these might actually take a back burner. Maybe we flip that upside down because there is a role of even direction. If I were to add a fifth bullet point, it'd be direction of oversight. Like we manage the household. But these become the priority. Notice that Paul cares more about the character of these leaders than he does really point out all of the job descriptions, because all of these flow out of the character. Do they look like Jesus? Do they want other people to look like Jesus? Then these will naturally start to be some of the outpouring. They will disciple people. Why? Jesus said, go make disciples. They will teach what's true. Why? Because they're disciples of Jesus. They will defend that. They will defend the people. They will defend the health of the church. Why? Because they know what Jesus gave up for the church. Will they discipline? Yeah, they'll discipline just because God, as our Father, also disciplines those whom he loves. Now, the discipline, like we saw in 1 Timothy 20, or chapter 1, verse 20, will be with love so that they have the opportunity to come back. They'll chase after the one to bring them back to the 99. If you're interested in studying more when it comes to healthy elders and even healthy deacons, which we'll deal with in our next session, there's actually an entire series that we have here on Next Level that's labeled Healthy Elders, Healthy Deacons, where I unpack other passages, not just in 1 Timothy, on this particular topic. I also would invite you, if you have conversations you'd like to have, I'd be more than happy to have a conversation with you about some of the implications of this and what that might look like in your church today.